What's up, y'all? It's Project Photography back in the video, and today's episode we're going to talk about when you should use foreground elements in your landscape photography. Now, to me, using foreground elements is a little bit overdone in landscape photography. Everyone seems to think that using a foreground element is the be-all, end-all to every single landscape photo, that every single landscape photo should have a foreground element. And I'm just here to say that I don't think that's absolutely true. I think that this is one of the methods that everybody kind of naturally gravitates towards if there's nothing else to do. And I think there is some merit to that, but I don't think that you should make that your central focus of your landscape photography, especially since, everyone's kind of doing it. And there's just a lot of other interesting things that you can take photos of rather than just having the traditional foreground element and a background element. Like I said, the thing about foreground elements in landscape photography is that it's good in moderation, as everything in life is. That if you keep doing it, it gets boring after a while. All of your photos become predictable, and people seem to expect that you're just going to be doing that as a landscape photographer, and that's really not what a landscape photography is about. And I think you want to exude that in other ways, but also incorporate foreground elements in your photos, especially when you feel like it's warranted. And this episode of the Project Photography is here to do just that. Tell you when you should use it and how to not overdo it, because I think that's a really crucial thing in landscape photography. Me personally, I do use foreground elements sometimes, not all the time, only when I feel like it's warranted and in moderation, of course. And I'll give you some of my rundowns on how I'm able to do this and in what situations it makes sense. So when you're shooting landscape photography and you do successfully incorporate a foreground element in the right context, of course, it does a few things for you. The first one is it kind of gives a three-dimensional kind of feel to your photo. And what it means is that when there's something in the background, you don't really have enough perspective or enough context or really gauge how far away that subject is or how big it is, especially because if you're shooting wide angle, everything kind of in the background becomes a lot smaller. But when you have that foreground element, it kind of anchors the photo down in a sense that you kind of have a little bit of context, a little bit of perspective as to how big that subject is in the background. And it kind of gives that three-dimensional look that I really like, especially if it's done in the right way. So you might be asking yourself, when is the right time to use foreground elements in your landscape photography? And one of the first criteria that I have to check off in order to know whether to use foreground elements or not is whether or not you have enough intriguing elements within the photo. So for example, this photo right here, this was taken in Hawaii, kind of the North Shore area. As you can see, there's not really that many interesting elements in the background specifically. There's a lot of trees, a lot of kind of water. I use these middle three kind of foreground elements right here to include some interesting elements and kind of make the photo a lot more interesting as a whole, because if I just had the background, it would not be nearly as interesting. And of course, I'm only able to do this if the foreground element itself is interesting, and in this case it makes a lot of sense because the foreground elements kind of has a sort of symmetrical feel to them, and I just really like the rocks and how the long exposure kind of makes everything seem so still and dreamy almost. And in this context, it makes a lot of sense. And when you're doing landscape photography, you have to understand that when you're using foreground elements, it has to be in a certain context for it to make sense. Because the goal of having foreground elements is to simply enhance your photos, not add more clutter. For example, if a landscape photo already has a lot going on in it already, it makes no sense to have a foreground element in the first place. Like this photo right here, I took in one of my last videos where I go out to a beach and pretty much shoot landscape photography at Blue Hour, and I attempted to have a foreground element in one of my photos simply because it was just a different perspective. I want to try something out a little bit different than the photos before, but the reason why it does not work here is because the background is already interesting enough and it already has a lot going on, so there's no really point in having a foreground element. It doesn't really anchor anything, because as you saw in that video, I actually have a lot of photos that exhibit kind of depth and that more interesting subject matter to the point where I don't really need foreground elements. It just does not make sense. And in a lot of cases, that is going to be what's going to happen, because you don't necessarily need foreground elements in absolutely every photo. Very specific times where you're actually going to need it. And especially having way too many subjects to focus on makes the whole photo really confusing. Your mind doesn't really know what to gravitate towards or what to really read from the photo itself. It becomes a lot of a clutter, a lot of a mess, and it does not end up being a good photo. So to really have a successful foreground element, background element approach is to have an A to B approach, where A is kind of your foreground element and your B is the background, the subject that you want to really emphasize. Because what a foreground element really does is emphasizes whatever your B subject is. Like in this photo right here, this makes a ton of sense because the background itself is this nice mountaintop, and then you have the beautiful sky at the top. but then it's super far away, so it's smaller. And because I'm using a wide angle, it appears a lot less significant or big as it is, because that mountain is actually really big, but when I'm shooting with a 20 mil, it really de-emphasizes the scale of the actual mountain itself. So by having a foreground element and an A to B approach, you're able to see that there's two main subjects, and the first one really grounds the entire photo as a whole and leads you kind of to that background with the mountains and then the sky. It's a great way to add depth to your photo, and it's a very simple thought process. A to B, that's it. That's all you really got to do. See, I actually did not like foreground elements before. I thought it was tacky, and I thought it was just really not well done, because a lot of the photos that I see in landscape photography, it just didn't work for a lot of them. And then I started kind of meticulously deciding whether or not when to use foreground elements, and I found that it only works in very specific scenarios. And a lot of people like to overdo it, and I will definitely be the first to stride away from that concept, simply because there's a lot of other interesting parts of a landscape, and the foreground element is not the most interesting to me. If you don't have an interesting background or interesting kind of subject matter in the first place, then a foreground element won't really do much to it, because then that foreground element becomes the entire landscape, and that's not the whole point of landscape photography. So one last thing is to make sure you have focus throughout the entire photo, because there's been times where I focus on the foreground element, but then the background is just kind of blurry. So you either want to do that by focus stacking or having a higher aperture number. Like, you probably want to shoot somewhere between f13 and f16. It's going to introduce a little bit of diffraction, but I mean, that's a price you got to pay for having foreground elements. So that's another reason why I don't really like doing foreground elements too much, because I like shooting at f8. That's kind of my sweet spot. And I really don't want to go above that, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do. So yeah, anyways, that's kind of my take on foreground elements. Don't overdo it. Only do it in specific scenarios, and I think you'll be okay with shooting foreground elements. So yeah, that's pretty much it for me, guys. Please let me know what you guys thought about this video down in the comment section down below. Check out my other stuff, and I will catch you guys in the next one.